That right from the outset, God would be actively working to bring about his redemptive plan to draw humanity back into relationship with him. And so last week we learned about how God chose Abraham, a man of obedient faith, who would be given the promises of God. And after Abraham there was Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, one of which Scripture tells us was Joseph, whom Jacob had special favor towards. And that's going to be the focus of our time together today, looking at Joseph. Joseph is one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I think of all the times where you hear about this is what a biblical man is, or these warriors and these kings and everything, and here's Joseph, a dreamer, one who's sensitive to the Spirit of God in his life. But even him, he must ask, how did I get here? And that's what we're going to talk. Have you ever asked yourself that question, how did I get here? Not necessarily here, like today, this moment. But in this particular situation, time in your life, how did you end up in this situation? Looking back at your life, decisions that you made, maybe decisions that your families before you, your ancestors made, that brought you to this point. I know we have a good number that have come to Canada from other countries. And that was a decision that you made. We're going to start a new life. Perhaps it would be, I'm going to come and I'm going to learn, I'm going to study here and then go back to my homeland. Or maybe it's just a completely new trajectory for your life, for your kids and your grandkids, your future. How did you end up here? For me personally, I look at my life and I go, it wasn't as much coming from another country, although that was the story of my ancestors as well, before I was born though. But for me personally, I grew up on a farm. And then after Bible school, ended up in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. And then through a series of events and something beyond what we ever anticipated or desired to do, we went to British Columbia. At the time, I was like, why would I want to go there? No idea. It was beautiful, but I was kind of scared. British Columbia. But we ended up going there. We were 12 years in Surrey, going from a town of Yorkton of 16,000 people to sprawling greater Vancouver and over 400,000 people in Surrey. It was different. How did I end up there? And then to Abbotsford, and then ultimately here to Lethbridge. Do you think that sometimes when you look at your life? How did you end up here, where you are? Well, Joseph probably asked that question various times. And I'm going to do a simple sum up of the story. We've given you the resources in the scriptures for you to be a little more prepared as you come to the sermon, because there's a lot in the story. And so if in case you have not read those scriptures, this is the even less than a Cole's Notes version. This is the short version of the story. And so Joseph was the youngest son of Jacob at this time, hated by his brothers, sold as a slave to Egypt, believed to be dead by his father, unjustly accused of a crime that he did not commit, ended up in prison, was found to be able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, and then promoted out of that to second in command of Egypt, saved his family from the famine, forgave his brothers, and through it all, understanding that this was all part of God's plan. There we go. That's it, right? Wrap it up. Let's go home. There's a little more, but that's the summation of the story. And so in the midst of this, Joseph is asking, probably himself, various times, how did I end up here? Well, let's go to the beginning. Genesis 37, verse 1 to 11. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph, Israel, another name for Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Verse 9, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. All right, and so a few scenarios here. How did Joseph end up in the places that he ended up? First of all, how did he end up in this pit, in this cistern we're going to hear about? Well, these were things that stirred up anger and jealousy among his brothers. First of all, he was a tattletale. He was a rat. You know, he would tell on his brothers. This is what verse 2 says, that he was hanging out with these brothers, and he brought a bad report to his father about them. You know, he was a rat. There's one in every family, I think, of siblings, right? You're laughing, but how many of you were that rat? No, you're okay. How many of you know exactly which of your siblings was the one? I always went, I'm going to mom with that. I'm going to tell dad. There's one in every family. So this didn't bring about a lot of love, for Joseph with his brothers. Secondly, he was Jacob's favorite. We know that he was the son of Rachel, and Rachel was the wife that Jacob loved. She was the one that he really wanted from the beginning, and then his father-in-law Laban did this kind of little trick thing, and all of a sudden he ended up with Leah, who was the first one. Should get married first, right? And so he had Leah, but Rachel was the one that he loved. And it says that in verse 3, that Jacob loved Joseph more than the others. I mean, that's always kind of a bad thing in a family, right? And maybe you're thinking, okay, I know who the tattletale was among my siblings. Who's the one that mom loved the most? The dad liked the most? Maybe that person. Maybe it's you. But that's never always a good thing to develop the warmth of the familial relationship there. But this is what Jacob did. He loved Joseph because he was the son of Rachel, the woman that he loved. And so we see this until, and then later on Benjamin comes along, is also a son of Rachel. He was Jacob's favorite. So in that special relationship, he gives Joseph this gift of this special coat. I mean, this must be it. It's beautiful. This special ornate robe, okay, with long sleeves, this long flowing robe, and this was really a sign, not just like, I'm going to give this my favorite child a nice gift to set them apart. It was an idea of this was royalty. This was going to be the heir, right? He was saying that Joseph, as the son of Rachel, the one that he really loved, was really the firstborn, the one that was legitimate as the heir. And so gives Joseph this beautiful robe. And it's one thing for Jacob to say, okay, Joseph, I'm giving you this nice gift. And for Joseph to say, oh, that's nice. I'll, put it in my room or my special drawer, bring it out on, special occasions or whatever. It seems like he wore it, like a lot, or regularly. This is what, he's showing it off. Like, hey, guys, guess who's the favorite, right? That didn't win him any favors either. We see that when he goes to visit his brothers, and this is where they throw him in the pit, he was wearing it, right? He was wearing it. Fourth, he had dreams, and what does he do with them? Talks about them, shares them, right? Sometimes I think that dreams are powerful, and dreams can be used by God to point out things, to teach things, and just alert you to things. Sometimes you can say it is just bad tacos, right? We don't know, sometimes dreams. But this was a very, very specific dream, and we know on the other side of the story it was very prophetic. This is what would actually happen. But in this scenario, Joseph, 17 years old, perhaps not quite developed in his, social cues or, emotional IQ. He says, guys, I had this dream. You all bow down to me. Probably not what they were loving hearing. Now, we know this is that what he did brought some of this on himself, but again, it was part of God's plan. All part of it in the upward story. We see in the story that his brothers first want to kill him, their own brother, and so they throw him in a pit. Then over lunch they say, what does this do for us? Maybe another option. Because they had thought, okay, we'll kill him, we'll soak this little garment thing, that Dad gave him in blood, bring it back to Dad and say these wild animals killed him. It's tragic, not much left of him. But then throw him in this cistern that's dry, no water in there. What good does that do us? We don't get much out of this. Aside from a little bit of, our jealousy is aggrieved here a little bit, just, we could make some money on this, right? And so this is what, I like verse 26 of chapter 37, where, Judah says, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. Get this. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. That's like, yeah. He's actually, he's our family. He's family, guys. Family. We can't kill him. Let's sell him. Let's make a profit on it. Let's make some money. Okay? And 20 shekels, kind of the standard price for a slave. So we look at verse 23 and 24 of chapter 37. It says, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe, again, he was wearing it, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. How do you end up in that pit? There you go. So secondly, how did I end up in Potiphar's house? Chapter 39 talks about the Midianites or the Ishmaelites. It's just kind of the same. It's talking about that these were not the covenant people, okay, from the seed of Abraham, part of the covenant. And so I don't know if these Ishmaelites, they're kind of traveling gypsies or something like that, and they're traveling around the roads, and they're checking out their Facebook marketplace. I don't know. It's like, oh, there's a guy just up ahead, just for sale. And they come along, and sure enough, this is the price. And then they carry on, and they probably don't have much need for this slave, but they say, well, we can also make a profit on it. So they upload it to their Facebook marketplace for 30 shekels. I don't know. Is that not in your version? No. But they made some money. They pass it on. They go to Egypt, and here's Potiphar. All right, they sell him to him. This is how he ends up in Potiphar's house. Verse 36 says, meanwhile, they sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And so while he's now in Potiphar's house, it says in verse 2 of chapter 39 that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And you'll see this throughout the stories. Even though Joseph might be saying, how did I end up here? He wasn't alone. The Lord was with him in it all. Blessed him. And so he becomes a successful manager in Potiphar's house. He didn't have to worry about a thing. Chapter 39, 1-6 talks about this, is that he was he was just a great manager. Potiphar just like, I don't have to worry about a thing. Not that Joseph applied for the job, because he was technically still a slave. But if he did, his cover letter would have said, motivated, self-starter. He just stepped in and just got things done and managed things so well. The Lord was with him. He prospered. And Potiphar just, there we go. Everything is good. Don't have to worry about a thing with Joseph running the show. But then, how did he end up in prison? How did he end up in prison? Well, we see this in chapter 39, verse 7. We're introduced to Potiphar's wife. Now, she was a treat. She was maybe part of Real Housewives of Egypt. I don't know. She was something, right? You can see it, right? You can see it. Well, she sees Joseph. And Joseph was like well-built and handsome, is what it says. Good to look at. And she was around him all day in the house. Potiphar's busy. Well, she goes to Joseph. It says day after day, sexually tempting him. Come to bed with me. And Joseph's response over and over again is, how could I do such a thing? How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So all of this, she didn't handle rejection well. And so she grabs him by the cloak and says, come to bed with me. And he just goes, no, and he runs and leaves his cloak behind. Now, it doesn't say this specifically. Probably he didn't have much on underneath, if anything. So he ran away like buck naked, just like, boom, out of there. I got to get out of here. Didn't look really good for Joseph. She's got the cloak there in her hands, and she's been spurned. And so she comes up with this story, this lie, that this slave, Joseph, has sexually assaulted her. And Potiphar loses it, throws Joseph in prison. Now, just one thing in terms of this. I think that we can look and see what the Apostle Paul was talking about and referring to probably in his mind when he was writing 1 Corinthians, the letter to the church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18, when he says, flee sexual sin. Run from it. There's things in our life that come at us, and I don't think it's just sexual sin, but this one that the Apostle Paul speaks to directly, that this is a big deal. This is something that you can't just say, you know what, I'm going to face this temptation head on. Put the dukes up, let's go, come on, I'm ready. He says, no, you don't fight it face to face, you run. There's times that you just get out of there. You need to run from it. Leave your cloak behind. Just get out of there. Flee sexual sin. Don't mess around with it. Get out of the situation. And this is what Joseph does. And you like to say, oh, that was good. He ran from temptation, and that's how he was saved. But he wasn't actually. He got in trouble, and he's thrown in prison. How did I get there? But so he's in prison. And what does he do? It says again, the Lord was with him. Genesis 39, 20 to 21 says, while he was there in prison, the Lord was with him. And again, everything that he does prospered. The warden of the prison, he's kicking his feet up. Just like, man, Joseph's in charge of everything. It's going well. And finally, he's like, how did I end up as the deputy Pharaoh of all of Egypt? So chapter 41, verse 46, now Joseph is 30 years old. So from 17, now he finds himself 13 years later as the deputy Pharaoh in Pharaoh's service. And so we don't know exactly the time, how long he was in prison or how long he had been in Potiphar's house, but the overall time is about 13 years. And at least 2 of those were in prison. And so while he's in prison, there's a scenario that you can read about there, talk about the cupbearer and the baker and how he interprets their dreams. That's a great story. But then they get out. One is killed, as he predicted in the dream. The other one is kind of put back in his position but forgets about Joseph, right? Joseph says, hey, when you get out, remember me. Help me out of this, right? No, he forgets. So he's still in prison, but then Pharaoh has a dream. And in this dream, he's puzzled, and he gets all of his wise guys around, and they can't figure it out what this dream is all about. And they find out, well, who is there that can interpret dreams? And someone remembers, oh yeah, it was Joseph. And so Joseph, he's in prison, probably smelling pretty bad. Got to clean up to go see the Pharaoh, shave, clean him up, shower. There you go. Tells him the dream, and this dream is that there's these skinny cows, and they ate the fat cows. And the thin heads of grain swallowed up the good heads of grain. And Joseph interprets this dream, giving recognition to God. And he says that there's going to be 7 good years and then 7 years of famine. So be prepared. And the way that he explains the dream, he's so confident, he's so eloquent, and I don't know if the Pharaoh goes back and does some back checks or anything. You find out, wow, Joseph actually, he manages things really well. It seems that he has wisdom within him. Is there anyone that's better than this guy for the job of taking us through this economic time? Nope. Okay, you're hired. You're the guy. And so we see that Joseph, he went from being a dreamer to being a dream interpreter. But again, he says, not I, but God. So they go through 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And so from being sold as a slave, Joseph finds himself in this position of influence and power, and he does it well. Just a quick, this is how he does it. Verse 39, I don't think it was, rocket science. It says if he knows there's going to be abundance and, crops are good, bumper crops, let's bring them in. Let's find ways where we can store it. And so all around in the cities that produced it, he created these storehouses. And it says in chapter 41, verse 39, that there was so much grain, it was like the sand of the sea. And they kept such accurate records of it until they just said, we can't keep up anymore. Like, there's too much. The abundance was so abundant, they just said, we're just keep bringing it in, but we don't keep it anymore. This reminded me, I was thinking the other day of my dad, who was a farmer. We had a small farm, but I remember watching him or seeing the results of his mathematics on our barn wall. He would write on the barn wall all of his, how many bushels to the acre, and how many, I don't know. It was just his way of doing math and finding out, are we gonna have enough? And so this wasn't the situation in my farm where we just, said, man, where are we gonna put all this grain? It was not usually. It's like, how are we gonna make it through the winter? But in this scenario, there was just, the storehouses were full, were plenty. Just, we can't even keep up. Let's just stop for those 7 years. But then, true to the dream and his interpretation of it, famine hits. And so for 2 years, the first 2 years of famine, everything, is just gone completely dry, total famine. And this is when Jacob and his brothers, they say, we got to find some food. And who has it? Egypt. And so go down there and talk to this deputy Pharaoh, this governor, and work out things so that we can get food. This is what happens. And so in all of this, we see that now Joseph is 39 years old, and his brothers are sent to get food from Joseph. 22 years after his dream, it becomes a reality, and his family all bow down before him. He holds their lives in his hands. So what does this story reveal? A few things to take from here. So first of all, the story reveals the reality of this enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent we've seen from the beginning of Genesis 3:15. We see this strife and this conflict. There's fraternal battles and hatred. This is really the fruit of the serpent's seed. We see that from the beginning, where Cain killed Abel, where Ishmael is mocking Isaac, where Jacob deceived his father for Esau's birthright, for Joseph's brothers seeking to kill and to sell him. So we see this conflict has been right from the beginning, after the fall. This is what the enemy does. We see this throughout Scripture. We're going to continue to see it through the story, where Satan seeks to steal, to kill, and destroy, to cause chaos in families, in churches. I ask you today, have you witnessed this? I have. See, every time you convince yourself to hold the grudge, to refuse to forgive, to harbor resentment toward a brother, to sit on this side because you have something against someone on this side. I'm not saying that's the truth, it's reality, but we distance ourselves. We see there's this hostility and tension and conflict, and it happens within the church, within the family of God. This is the fruit of the seed of the serpent. We see it again and again. This is what this story reveals, that continues to happen. Secondly, it reveals a glimpse of the covenant promise. See, in Joseph, we see, again, the seed of Abraham, the seed of the woman who's been exalted to the right hand of power, who's been made fruitful in this land of his affliction. And it brings to the point where he's actually a blessing to all the nations. Do you hear this? Get this from Genesis 41, verse 57. All the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. The promise made clear, so clear to Abraham from the beginning, that you would be a light, you would be a blessing to all nations. We see a glimpse of that in the Joseph story. All the earth came, because they all had need, and they came to Joseph. In Joseph, we also have this anticipation of fulfillment of the blessing of Abraham. The curse reversal, in a way. When he forgives his brothers, Joseph overcomes that aspect of the enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So we see that glimpse of the covenant promise. Third, we can't miss the idea of the sovereignty of God within this story. One of the key verses coming out of this story is found in Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. This is when Joseph encounters his brothers, and he's weeping, and he's offering them forgiveness. And this is what he says. He says, you intended to harm me. You were going to kill me, then you sold me. You had harmful intent. But God all along was orchestrating this to accomplish the saving of many lives. This is maybe I don't know, it's not to be a kitschy line, but it's just this idea of humanity. We're playing checkers and God is playing chess. It's not that life is a game. It's just the idea is that God is a strategist. I don't even think sometimes we as humans play checkers, playing like hopscotch or blind man's bluff or something. We're clueless in ways what is happening and how we ended up where we ended up, and we think sometimes, that was my decision. And I orchestrated those circumstances so that I ended up exactly where I went. No, it was actually God. And God was steering things all along for you to be where you are for his purpose. We saw this in Esther, right? That nothing can thwart God's purposes, not a pagan nation that would rise up to try to destroy the Jews, to a famine, or the evil plan of sibling hatred. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So how about you? I can't stand here and say that I know or understand why you might have or are still going through a difficult trial. I can't say that I could tell you how you ended up here, for what reason. I can't say that I know what God intends for you, what you will learn, how God might be moving those chess pieces of your life so that you might have influence or impact on others. I don't know. You might see it one day, or you might not. But listen, this is important. if you have decided to trust Jesus with your life, and you have confidence in him that he is always working for your good, that he is always working to accomplish his purposes in your life, then in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the pain, that's what you hold on to. And in that there can be peace, and there can be a maturing of your faith. See, this is more than saying, this is what happens as a proverb of the world that says, when life gives you lemons, what do? You make lemonade. That's a world cliche. That's saying, things are going to happen tough. Hey, make something good of it. That's not what Joseph was saying. That wasn't his mantra through all of this. He was saying, God is with me. God has brought me to the place where I prospered, even in my difficult circumstances, and all along, he was orchestrating things for his purpose. And so when this lower story of your life is fraught with pain and sorrow, you can hold on to the hope that what God is doing in the upper story will ultimately bring about his holy good. Fourth and finally, it reveals what was to come in Christ. Again, just like the story of Abraham, this story isn't a hero story. This isn't a historical story alone. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus' story. See, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, innocent of crimes that he was accused of, unjustly imprisoned. He rose out of the pit and broke the grip of the serpent's seed by forgiving his brothers. Compare this to Jesus, who was betrayed by his kinsmen, sold for silver, innocent of crimes that he was accused of, suffered unjustly, and we could say as the true Joseph, provided the ultimate and eternal means of reconciliation and forgiveness through his death and his resurrection. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. We're going to sing a song of response to this. And as we do, the song is called Oceans. And in it, I want you just to consider, first of all, start with thinking about Joseph and all the things that happened to him and how he could say, man, how did I end up here? Thinking about how deep the Lord took him and how his feet wandered, as we're singing in the song, just in places where his faith was going to be stretched and grounded. But then move it into your story and say, hey, do I see myself in this story? The things that I have experienced, the ways that God has led me, and saying, how did I get here? How have I witnessed God steering in my life to bring me to today, to accomplish his purposes